Nitasha Kaul, let's turn to you. Let's hear your voice now. Do you agree with Professor Rockstrom? Do you think that climate change has been pushed off the agenda this year, or pushed to the side a bit?
Absolutely, and it's so worrying that these things are seen as if they're disconnected from each other, when all that is staring us in the face is the fact that our economies, our lives are embedded within ecology, and that there are complex effects from environment to public health, to people's livelihood, to species loss, and this simple link between the ways in which these ecological processes need to be managed politically is proving to be such a problem because of the increasing isolationism of multiple leaders around the globe. The other sad fact, of course, is that these are irreversible processes, environmental processes in many cases. So once we are past a tipping point, we can't, even if we were to muster the ability to do so, undo all of this. So they need the international cooperation, as well as they need the will to be able to do that. And right now we are missing both of those. I think that democracy is, when we think about them, I prefer to think of a biodemocracy, that, the link, I would argue, is between the political and the ecological. And what we're seeing, this devastation of the environment, is linked to people's abilities, to what they can do, and that also is linked to public health. So these are not disconnected crises; they're interlocking.
Indeed, and I'm sure we're going to be speaking about these issues for quite some time. I had mentioned earlier in the program that you've come out with a new book this year. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, actually, it's my novel. My second novel is called Future Tense, and it was published earlier this year. And the thing that strikes me is the timing of it, because I wrote it. It is set in Kashmir. It's about the lives of Kashmiris, and I wrote it post 2016, when there was a summer of mass blindings and the Human Shield incident in 2017, and then, of course, last year in August there was this abrogation of the statehood, which happened overnight, and the people were placed in lockdown, and my book came out after that, and then the whole world went into lockdown. So in a sense, it's a mise en abîme. It's kind of reflecting the complexities of life in conflict, and how that affects every bit of the lives of these characters. So if I had to say it in a line, I'd say it's about what happens to big dreams on small canvases that are made even smaller by the politics of conflict. It's a group of young people who are in that situation, and about their lives.
Okay, well, it sounds fascinating. Arundhati Roy is an award-winning Indian novelist and political activist.
Of course, the crime has gone up in the last few years, but the brutality of it and the frequency of this is so systemic that anyone who's pretending to be surprised is really playing a game.
You mentioned the frequency of these crimes. A woman is raped in India every 15 minutes on average. That's according to government data released earlier this year. Why is sexual violence so prevalent in India, and why is rape such a threat for Dalit women in particular?
Well, Dalit women have always been viewed traditionally as the property of dominant caste men. And one of the reasons that nothing changes is that, as you're seeing in the case of the Hathras killing, the girl, the day she was raped, she speaks on video, she identifies her rapist, she says she was raped, and yet it's not made out as a police complaint. The hospital that she goes to doesn't examine her or look at that aspect. They just look at the part of the grievous neck wounds and strangulation that happened. And as soon as she died, they cremated her in the middle of the night, locking the family into their home and refusing to let them come to destroy evidence. And so you'll see how the police, the hospitals, the courts, all of them collude to make it appear as if this was a regrettable but ordinary crime. They take caste out of the equation. And so there's a sort of impunity that sets in. And this is standard practice.
Can you put this into context for our audience who might not be so familiar with India's caste system? How is it that in modern India, some 200 million Dalits continue to face not just discrimination but violence.
Well, the caste system is a hierarchical system where society is divided into almost 4,000 castes and subcastes. At the top are the Brahmins, and at the bottom are Dalits, formerly known as untouchables. And it's a very small percentage of Indians who will marry outside their caste or who will really challenge the caste system in those ways. And Dalits, especially in rural areas, are for the most part landless. And usually you will have, as in the case of the village in the district of Hathras, you'll have very few Dalit households and the majority of dominant caste households. So they're always very vulnerable. And they're also, because the population is scattered, they really don't form a constituency that can get political power.
Even if there's no change at the top, are there any signs that there are changes afoot at the grassroots levels? Are any more women talking about this or taking action?
There are a lot of young, very articulate Dalit activists and scholars and writers, but there is a big rural and urban divide there. Urban Dalits in universities and in jobs, they face a different set of discrimination, but in rural areas, there is this egregious feudal violence. So this Dalit family now in Hathras is under tremendous pressure and in tremendous danger because the chief minister of that state is a Thakur and the men who've been accused of this rape are Thakurs, and that chief minister has to show himself to be loyal to that caste.
Arundhati Roy. Well, let's bring our guests in here. Nitasha Kaul, why do you think the caste system is so resilient in India?
It is resilient because it is a society which is marked deeply by this kind of extreme misogyny, casteism, and dehumanization. And it is a structural privilege which isn't easy to undo. And as Roy was just pointing out, I mean, the case here is of it is not surprising because what is surprising is only the level of brutality. But rapes of Dalit women, including by official accounts, happen, frequently, multiple times a day. In this case, it was a poor rural Dalit woman that makes her intersectionally marginalized in multiple ways. And the fact that, just like other movements, there is a very strong Dalit Lives Matter movement. So there are people who are doing their level best to raise this, to keep fighting against this. But what is problematic is that the structures, the political structures, the constitutional structures are not doing what they're meant to do. The chief minister of that state, has previously, before he became the chief minister, when he was an MP, shared the stage with somebody who called for the exhumation of the dead bodies of Muslim women and to rape them. I called him out in 2015, this out and on TV, and everyone said, well, he's just a fringe element. He's now the chief minister of the most populous state. And it's not surprising that this kind of lawlessness continues going on. And, the listeners would be surprised to know that Thakurs of the same caste as the perpetrators, alleged perpetrators, but perpetrators for me in this case, because of the woman's testimony, actually marched, gathered in support of the rapists. And as a Kashmiri, that makes me think immediately of the 8-year-old girl Asifa who was raped a few years ago, in Jammu and Kashmir, and people marched, including the ruling party legislators, in support of the rapists. The very idea of people actually marching or gathering in support of people who are accused of rape shows us how deeply entrenched this dehumanizing impulse is. It's banal and it's super evil, but it's just banal.
Indeed, sexual violence is a problem in many countries around the world. Michael Keating, do you think is it too late for Donald Trump to turn the election in his favor?
Well, I think that Trump is what he has shown is a political theater at its most absurd. To be honest, I think along with many other well-meaning people around the world, I think this is an important, crucial election. And I hope that the American people are able to see that someone who is so brazen in how he appeals to dog whistle, to outright smears, to just even with the White House event yesterday, the way he was speaking about people who disagree with him. He's absolutely indifferent to the well-being of anyone who isn't totally craven to him and to his mythology. And what he's done more broadly is destroyed trust in society. He's destroyed the possibility, he's doing his level best to destroy the possibility that people can come across divided partisan lines. So I don't know if it's too late for him to turn things in his favor, but if it is, I'll be shedding no tears about it.
I can hear. I don't think either one of you are major Donald Trump fans, but we have to admit he does have a base of support within the United States that seems quite solid in many ways. I mean, we've heard earlier in this program Catholic voters who were quite staunch in their support of the president because for them the issue of abortion was much more important than anything else. Is really the virus going to be the key issue for many American voters? Michael?
Well,
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Nitasha, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I don't know if it's just going to be the virus, but it's not surprising that he has support. I mean, if you don't care about the factual correctness of what you're saying, if you want to just, appeal to people's most basest instincts, then we have examples in history where many other leaders, including those who've come to power through elections, have in effect acted as authoritarians with their strong support base. And that's precisely the problem. The fact that these people support him without, with complete disregard for facts. It's a cultic kind of a thing with that sort of support. I mean, and with the Catholic support, as we heard earlier, it's also the fact that whether we are talking about these Catholics who are white and Hispanic, and it shows that there is a divide in that support there, as well as on abortion. I mean, I think that if there's care for life, then as people point out, what about the immigrants who are, whose lives are not cared for? So there are questions that in any political sphere ought to be asked with respect for, the opposing position. And that doesn't happen with someone like Trump.
Sir Carrie Brown. Now, I'm afraid we only have a brief time to chat about this, but Nitasha Kaul, the survey we've just discussed looks at perceptions within mostly Western countries, but what about India? Are attitudes towards China changing there?
There's a complexity in the Indian case in that China is both seen as communist versus democratic India, and therefore China is authoritarian. India cannot somehow be authoritarian because it's democratic, but also simultaneously that a leader like Modi is seen as a strong man precisely because he can, deal with the noise of democracy and bring development like China. So China plays a very complex role and this dual role in the Indian imagination. I mean, one thing I do want to very quickly state is that the distinction between state and people is important. It is important to sort of say China versus Chinese people who face discrimination, and we can hold these two realities that xenophobia is real, should be pushed back against, but also that human rights abuses and situations like in Xinjiang are things that need our attention, very much so.
Indeed. I mean, I know that you're making the distinction between state and people, but of course we're seeing a rise in hate incidents directed towards people of Chinese descent all around the world. Mike, a former UN envoy to Somalia, he happens to be in France this morning, and he joins me on the line from there. And Nitasha Kaul is a Kashmiri British novelist and academic based here in London, where she's an associate professor in politics and international relations at the University of Westminster. Nitasha is here in our London studio. So welcome to you both. I'm so pleased to have you both. We had spoken earlier in the program, and we'd sort of alluded to both of your experiences when you were both under lockdown, under various virus control measures in your respective homes. I wonder if we can just talk about that a little bit. Nitasha, what was it like for you to be in lockdown? I believe you were in London?
Yes, I was in the heart of Bloomsbury, a very deserted area because neither the tourists nor the students were around. It was for me particularly traumatic because I had a diagnosis which required a surgery just prior to lockdown, and as you know, all other non-COVID, so I completely empathize because all of that got cancelled and delayed for months. So I lived in enormous amounts of pain, and I really had to adopt very specific coping strategies just to be able to deal with, living by yourself, waiting for an operation in a lockdown situation. And super traumatic. I completely empathize with with the kinds of sufferings that those of us who did not have corona, so were spared that tragedy, but that we were unable to access healthcare and had to live in prolonged periods with suffering. So yes, I think there were times that I actually even got to resent birdsong out of the window because it just felt so so horrible to be stuck like that.
And when did things get a bit better for you?
As the restrictions were gradually relaxed, so I actually followed all the rules down to the letter, and it was when I was able to be more out and about, and finally, of course, when my operation was carried out, that was a huge relief. It truly felt like freedom to be a person again, to be able to eat or walk as normal. It was a sort of bliss for me.
And Michael, Nitasha Kaul, what are your thoughts on Amy Coney Barrett? And a lot's being made that she's a woman. She's being tested for the position to fill the seat vacated by the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Does that speak to you?
Well, yes. I'm starkly reminded of this phrase I read somewhere about her closing the doors that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had opened for her. I'm also more broadly feel that this weaponization of identity politics by the right wing is often done so cleverly and strategically in terms of appointing people with specific identities, like in this case, a woman who would then overturn the protections and the freedoms that many women that are dear to very many women in order to be able to live their lives. It's as if somebody would appoint someone to head the environmental body or a body that deals with discrimination whose views were completely contrary to that. And in this case, again, as has been pointed out, the fact that this is going to affect the courts for a generation because she's young, and it's worrisome. It doesn't have to be like this, but it shows how much they want to entrench their ideology, which is about overturning the freedoms for very, very hard-won freedoms for women, for sexual minorities, for environmental legislation, for governmental regulation of unprincipled commerce. It's worrisome, and it's the powerlessness of a certain kind of democracy in action when they can do it and they will.
It is 40 minutes. Natasha, are you optimistic that might happen?
I'm afraid in the case of the U.S., it's just horrifying. I wish I could say yes, but I completely echo Michael's sentiments. It's horrifying to have just heard that. It's beyond me how it can be considered civilized to actually not care for people's health. This is the most crucial ingredient of human well-being. People who are sick, unwell, infirm, diseased, cannot function. So the very idea of talking about economic growth means nothing if it does not translate into this very basic fundamental thing, which should be a right rather than as something that people fear and have to go bankrupt for. The 210,000 deaths, the sheer visualization of it in supposedly the most advanced, inverted commas, country in the world, it beggars belief. And I think the thing to see here is how difficult it is to undo these kinds of entrenched interests in a system. And with the political debates recently in the U.S., including amongst the incumbent and Trump and Biden and others, indicate how difficult it is to shift that in the U.S., where there's a kind of peculiar understanding of individualism and well-being, which is actually anti-society. Health is a public good. It has positive externalities. People not being ill isn't just helpful for them, it's helpful for everyone around them, for the whole system. So I'm afraid it needs a very strong political position that sustainedly can push through, and I hope that does happen, but it's something that is a global problem, although it's much more sad when it happens in countries that can afford to do this and still don't. And sometimes in my experience, I've seen much smaller countries, or even down to state level. I'm thinking here of a place like Kerala, a state in south of India. I'm thinking here of a small country like Bhutan. Places that I know will care much more for people being ill than the US.
And Michael just briefly happens to be in France this morning and joins me on the line from there. And Nitasha Kaul is a Kashmiri British novelist and academic based here in London, where she's an associate professor in politics and international relations at the University of Westminster. And Nitasha is here in our London studios. We're going to be hearing more from them both in a moment or two. But first, President Trump has delivered a speech full of support does President Trump really enjoy among blacks and Latinos in the United States? Dr. Kimberly Carnshaw is a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia Law Schools and founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum.
Well, I'd say his level of support is fairly low, particularly among African American women. So this latest moment in his campaign has been to try to elevate those numbers, not so much just to get their votes, but to suppress the enthusiasm for the Democratic ticket.
And is that strategy working?
So his level of approval among African American men actually is far higher than his level of approval among African American women. That can play out in two ways. It could play out in terms of just suppressing the turnout for the Biden-Harris ticket, which is what they actually need, particularly in battleground states, to prevail, or whether it will turn into more votes for Donald Trump among African American men. I think their gambit is to just simply suppress the level of turnout for Biden and Harris.
It's interesting because the polling evidence shows that the black and Latino voters who supported Donald Trump in 2016 still appear to support him. How would you explain this, especially in light of Donald Trump's failure to condemn white supremacy?
One of the things that is underemphasized in American politics is, frankly, the appeal of strongman politics, the appeal of authoritarianism in politics, the appeal of just straight out sexism. We don't really have a deep dive into the role that those values play in assessing who appears to be a good leader, in assessing whether on balance you are more turned on by the strongman than turned off by the unfortunate things that the strongman has to say.
Is pocketbook economics also a force at play here? There is some evidence that unemployment in the black community has gone down during Donald Trump's time. Do you think that might play a role?
Not necessarily, because if that were the case, you would have many, many more black women voting for Trump, both in 2016 and now. You know, the pocketbook issues have been offered as a justification or a way of understanding the depth of Trump support among working class people. But, you know, nobody is more working class than black women. And neither the argument that people support Donald Trump, nor they support Donald Trump because the economic profile is looking better, as is the argument now, seem to take into account black women's economic issues. In reality, I mean, we just have to look to see what Trump had to say last week to explain some of why black women are so opposed to Donald Trump. I mean, he called Kamala Harris a monster. Black women are very much aware of how we are framed, both as women without value because we're black and black people without respect because we're women. That really drives a significant amount of black women's opinion about Trump, and may also explain why there are a greater number of black men who aren't quite feeling that outrage to the same degree.
What difference does Kamala Harris's role in the election make?
There were some who think having a black person will bring black voters out, others thinking having a woman, others thinking having a person of Asian descent. It's as though one part of her speaks to each constituency that is now being represented in this historic first. But she is not just a black person, a woman, and a person of Asian descent. She's all of those things. And while it's mobilizing for some, it's counter-mobilizing for others. It's not abundantly clear that all black folks will necessarily get behind her because she's a woman. It's not clear that all women, or as many women, will be mobilized because actually she's black, and so on and so forth. So it's an intersectional question whether her breakthrough candidacy will break through some of the internalized barriers against a Black person, against a woman, or against a person of Asian descent. I think, though, what has really been interesting and maybe more mobilizing than we initially thought was the way she's been treated since the debate. Trump calling her a monster, many of the critics criticizing her performance in ways that feel very familiar to women, especially to women of color. That may have more of a mobilizing impact than initially folks thought.
That was Professor Kimberly Carnshaw of UCLA and Columbia Law Schools. She's also the founder and executive director of the African American Forum. Nitasha Kaul, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Kamala Harris. I'll pose the same question to you that I asked Kimberly Carnshaw. What difference does her role as a vice presidential candidate make?
Well, I think that it's really important that what Kimberly Crenshaw just highlighted about how she has been called these things by Trump, and recognizing the misogyny at the heart of it is just as important. So I've in my work I've argued that what Trump represents is the extreme of the phenomenon that we see globally, which is that there's a global league of electorally legitimated but not necessarily democratic in action, electorally legitimated misogynist authoritarians who claim a monopoly on nationalism and label their critics as anti-national and claim to challenge neoliberalism while facilitating crony capitalism. I mean, it's literally the formula. So when we look at the class aspect, when we look at the race aspect, when we look at the identity aspect, it's identity that is important, but it's also this particular strategy that they adopt. And in the Trump case, the education. So when he projects that he has the support of all of these people, from marginalized identities, he's trying to project that. But equally crucial is the fact that the way he went after critical race theory. I mean, there's a connection between what a white supremacist political ideology does not like about someone like Kamala Harris, and also what they don't like about critical race theory, which is the idea of being able to think critically. Trump's support is highest. It's one of the highest support base that he has is amongst people with no college education. So these are people who want to play with facts, who don't want critical education, and that's and add to which, I mean, I do have to say, it's so amazing to hear him speak about how after Lincoln he's the savior of the black people, as he did yesterday as well. When there's evidence that that journalists have uncovered of active attempts at voter suppression using big data. It's staggering how that world that he lives in, but he's just the most extreme phenomenon of something that is globally happening with multiple leaders around the world right now.
Mm-hmm. Michael Keating, how, just going back to what Kimberly Crenshaw. Now, Michael, David is one example, but it just brings together communities, doesn't it? That's a fantastic example. Nitasha, did you see any good examples during lockdown of people kind of really rising to the fore?
Yes, absolutely, Celia. I think that one of the things that it showed quite clearly, people helping the homeless, sending messages to each other. I mean, we, just even receiving, just checking up on other people, offering to get, whether it's a hand wash or their food for them, in incredible amounts of solidarity. And I mean, I of course, there's one thing I do want to say. I want to congratulate David McGuire, but also say that in the wonderful future, when cinemas will open again, will someone please make a movie about something like this, about people helping other people? Because while we must take care with the virus, I think we should spread this kind of kindness. This is it's such a feel-good story of people actually, mobilizing other people, because it's contagious, this kind of thing. It's so wonderful to hear about it.
Oh, but Nitasha, I mean, you're a writer. Don't you think this is going to lead to a whole raft of interesting novels and books, really, that draw from this time, this strange but oddly wonderful in some ways time?
The thing about writers is that a certain kind of isolation has always been central to us. So if you look at, there's a long history of literature, not just Albert Camus' The Plague, but a long history of literature where people have written about, this kind of existentialist feel of being by themselves. But I'm hoping that apart from that kind of isolation that the modern world in many ways has shown us, I feel that I wish that there would be also more stories, and I've specifically mentioned the cinema because I think I really miss that idea of social intimacies of various kinds, where in a world where living meant something else.
Absolutely. Let's all look forward to the day we can all go back to the cinema. Well, we're